All right, thanks so much, Jacob.
Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, I am excited to talk to you all today about lichens of Colorado. As Maggie mentioned, I'm a PhD student and just kind of embarking on the first ever lichen inventory of the entire state. And we had to start somewhere, so we've started in Boulder County with the City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks. And my lab mate Seth is also doing some work in the Indian Peaks Wilderness. Um, and the talk today will be very informal and lots of pretty pictures about just giving everyone a good baseline for understanding what lichens are and how to identify them. Um, and just kind of an appreciation talk, trying to open your eyes a little bit and allow you to see lichens a little bit more when you're out in nature. And I want to give a huge shout out to my advisor, Aaron Menzito Tripp, um, who is an excellent lichenologist and has provided a lot of the pictures and slides today. So you'll see a kind of tour of both eastern lichens, and at the end we'll go into some of the most common lichens in Colorado that you might see while you're walking around. So without further ado, um, I'll move on to the next slide. Yeah, so lichens are, as you may have noticed or may not have noticed, they're extremely colorful. They're all different colors from red to blue to this beautiful orange here, and almost any color under the rainbow. They're extremely abundant. They're on all 7 continents on the planet. And yeah, they're found pretty much everywhere you look. But uh, it seems as though they're underappreciated and very enigmatic organisms. So, for example, it's kind of crazy that for the last 50 years we've had a flora of Colorado, completely documented with 3,000 plus species of vascular plants, but the lichens are essentially understudied and not fully documented in the state yet. And that's just one example. Um, Colorado is extremely diverse, as y'all know, and yet we don't know what's here yet. So we're really doing these preliminary studies at the moment as lichenologists, just documenting new species and documenting what occurs where. Yeah, as I mentioned, Colorado is home to a vastly understudied lichen biota. So you might be wondering, what actually is a lichen? Lichens are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. So the fungus is called the mycobiont. Um, as you can see, it kind of encases the algae. I hope you all can see my cursor. Um, but you see the hyaline cells, or the clear cells here, are fungal cells, and then the green cells are algal cells. And they're living together in a single organism, in tight co-occurrence and relationship. So it's a symbiotic relationship between these two organisms. So when you talk about a lichen, you're actually talking about at least 2 different organisms. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble moving the slides. But so if you were to take a cross section of a lichen, you would see obviously both fungal and algal tissue. But the upper layer is a kind of protective layer called the cortex, and it's this densely packed fungal tissue that looks like skin. And so it's like a dull protective layer, and then just below that is where the algae live. because they're trying to get as much light as possible. Just like a plant is reaching for light, these algae are kind of growing at the top, just below that protective layer. And then below that, just like a plant, there's like a spongy mesophyll, if you're familiar with plant stuff, but it's like this loosely packed layers of fungal hyphae just below that, and then another lower cortex layer. And then they have like root-like structures that are called rhizines. And so that's just attaching them to surfaces, not uptaking any nutrients. They actually take all of their nutrients from the air, generally speaking. And that's what allows them to live in a lot of different places. So as I mentioned, these lichens are multiple different organisms, but for the most part, mostly because they're understudied, we actually just name the fungus. But if you were to look at a phylogenetic tree of life or an evolutionary history of life, you would find within just a single lichen species, you'd have members of the tree of life from fungi and from plants, as well as from bacteria, in particular cyanobacteria. And in this picture here is a specialized lichen organ called a cephalodium, where it's actually encased a bunch of cyanobacteria in an anoxic environment so that they can fix nitrogen. Just like in the Fabaceae or the bean family of plants, root nodules are associated with fixing nitrogen. So it's a kind of cool parallel evolution there where some lichens have evolved nodule-like structures that are associated with nitrogen fixing. And these organisms have really complex reproduction, which I'm going to go into in a lot more detail later, but the fruiting body of a lichenized fungus is called an apothecium, similar to like a mushroom that you might see in nature. And then the spores are called ascospores, and they're born in these little sac-like structures, and you can see they're all clustered in these groups of 8 here in this cross-section of one of those reproductive structures. So Trabuxia is the most common genus of algae that associates with lichenized fungi, and this is from actually a lichen that parasitizes other lichens, Caloplaca epithelina. But you can see the algae are encased in these little hydrophobic capsules, which basically maintains the fungus and the algae essentially in one, as if they were one organism. So because it's in this little capsule, any of the photosynthates or nutrients that the algae need can diffuse from the fungus to the algae, and anything that the algae photosynthesizes will diffuse into the fungus as if they were one organism. So this is an example of a lichen species called Flavoparmelia caparata, extremely common out east and relatively rare around here. But you can see it looks green, and most of the lichens that appear green are going to have a green algal photobiont. But they can also associate with other genera and other groups of algae. Trentipolia, you might know from mostly subtropical and tropical regions if you've been around and looking at free-living algae, but they are associated with their orange color because they produce chemicals that are similar to the chemicals that leaves produce when they're about to fall in the fall. And trentipolioid lichens, or lichens that associate with trentipolia, are actually pretty rare in Colorado because they like nice humid environments. And then one of the most common other photobionts is cyanobacteria, as I mentioned earlier. And they usually look brown or even black in color. And a common name for these would be like jelly lichens, because they have a jelly-like consistency when they're wet, and then when they dry out, they get really crunchy and hard. But Fuscopinaria is actually a pretty common genus in Colorado, and it likes to grow in these like really mossy, moist places. And lichens are really weird, so they can have both photobionts in a single individual. And this is a really rare occurrence, but you can see that, as I mentioned, the cyanobacteria is going to look very brown. So this section here is a cyanobacterium, but the green leafy parts, leafy looking ones, are actually a green alga, and it's all in one. And so we call that photosymbiodemes, just because it has two photosymbionts. And this is a common species in Colorado, Peltidra leucophlebia. You'll probably see this between 10,000 and 12,000 feet in really like mesic mountain valleys. It'll grow on the ground, and it's a very large lichen. But as I mentioned earlier, those specialized structures that are similar to the nodules in the Fabaceae, the bean family, these are called cephalodia. And you can see a close-up image of one of those cephalodiums here. And so lichens are actually really important for fixing nitrogen and just nitrogen cycling in general in our ecosystems in Colorado. So I want to go over just the basics of growth forms, because if you are ever reading about lichenology or trying to use dichotomous keys to lichens, one of the most important things that it'll ask you is, what's the growth form? And so this is just beautiful examples of some of those growth forms, and we'll get into the details. So the first and most widely recognized potentially growth form is foliose lichens. And we just call them foliose because they look like leaves, leaf-like. But they have a differentiated upper and lower cortex. So you can imagine the upper cortex is appearing green because the algae, it's a translucent surface, and then the algae are appearing green, so the lichen's looking green. But then the lower cortex appears brown, or it could be any color, but it's usually brown or anywhere between brown and black. But this is a super common growth form, and usually the best studied lichens are foliose lichens, so you might find the most resources about these lichens. And they're definitely a good starting point for learning lichenology because of that. If you've ever been to Pacific Northwest, you might have seen this species. It's a really famous species, but it's called Loberia pulmonaria. It's another foliose lichen. It's the lungwort is the common name because the little striations here look like little alveoli or lung sacs. The next growth form is fruticose. Fruticose lichens have a photobiont layer all the way around. So it's like it's it's not differentiated upper and lower cortex like foliose lichens. It's just parallel on both sides. So these are three different examples of common fruticose lichens. Ramalina, Usnea, and Cladonia are all really common in Colorado, generically speaking, or at the genus level. Um, and I'm sure you've seen these if you're walking around and curious about lichens in Colorado. These will be this genus in particular, Usnea, is covering a lot of trees, especially above about 7,000 feet. These are just two other Usneas from the eastern US. They're gorgeous organisms. And then the third growth form is crustose. They look like little crusts because they have no lower cortex, so you cannot remove them from the substrate. Or in otherwise speaking, they're glued to the substrate. And these are actually the least studied but also most diverse group of lichens in any biota that you might walk into. But you can see how like the bark is here and the lichens here, or here. There's a boundary between the lichen and the bark, but they're closely oppressed, and hence called crustose because they look like little crust. These also grow on rocks, especially out west. There's a lot of rock substrate available, and as I mentioned, lichens will grow anywhere. So crustose growth form is a really good one to know, and will definitely come up in any dichotomous key or species description as you're exploring. And finally, the last major growth form that we use is squamulose. And squamulose is a weird growth form. It's kind of like foliose, but the little lobes tend to be overlapping. So you can see it's like kind of a mess of different lobes. So it's similar to foliose in that it has a differentiated upper and lower surface, or cortices. But squamulose generally is defined as the lobes are overlapping, and the lobes are tending to be shorter than foliose lobes. And then a minor form, but still important, is leprose. And it's named after this genus Lepraria. Lepraria is common worldwide, and it's actually super diverse, but really hard to identify. So, but leprose is just lacking any sort of cortex. It's just bundles of hyphae and algae together. Sweet. So I'm keeping this super informal, so here's a pop quiz. If you want to put your answer in the chat or just shout it out loud, what growth form are these two species? Fruticose. Correct. Yeah, Usnea strigosia is actually potentially common down in southern Colorado, but you wouldn't really see that up here as much. And yeah, Ramalina, super awesome fruticose genus. Next one. Yeah, Abby's sweeping the competition. Crustose. Next. This one's kind of tricky. Good guess, Lepros. Really good guess. We'll go over what these little Lepros-like granulose things are at the tips, but it's actually foliose. Yeah, it also looks squamulous. So I said this one's tricky. Um, it's a really zoomed in picture of a of a foliose lichen, but from this picture alone, you might guess squamulose. Another good guess. Yeah, they're overlapping, but it's hard to see the scale. This is a very, very large organism, and so the overlap isn't necessarily the best character. It's really that the squamules are as short as they are long, or as long as they are wide. And these are clearly longer than they're wide, um, and look like little leaves. So this is foliose. And Peltidra is a really good genus to know. They're almost always in Colorado, at least on the ground, um, and usually appearing this drab brown color. Fruticose. Heck yeah. Nice one, Anne. Yeah, this is fruticose. So there's a photobiont layer that goes all the way around each of these little stalks. This one's hard as well. Yeah, crustose. Crustose, and it could be mistaken for lepros as well. It looks really fuzzy like the lepros, but it's it has like a very, very minute lower layer, so we would call it crustose. Um, Lepros is literally just little balls of algae and fungi together. Um, so we're already experiencing how lichens can be really dumbfounding and hard to interpret. Sweet. Um, so the next section of the talk is just talking about different lichen substrates. And so lichens grow on pretty much everything, as long as the surface is stable enough and long lived enough. Lichens will grow on it essentially. So, and we have specialized words in lichenology to talk about these things, but I'll just go over them because you will probably see them in any keys or descriptions. But corticulus means growing on bark, as in this species here. Terriculus, with the root ter, meaning soil. Saxiclus means growing on rock. Musciclus is on moss. And then they'll grow on leaves, not out in Colorado, but foliaculus. Ligniculus, licheniculus on other lichens. Saprophytic, fungiiculus, and algiculus. So they'll grow on everything. But the most common words you'll see in the literature are going to be corticulus, terriculus, saxiclus, musciclus, and ligniculus. These are the most common substrates. So we're just gonna show you some pretty pictures of lichens growing on different things. Just growing on bark. Here's a gorgeous lichen that actually uptakes some of the iron from the rock and becomes orange as a result. So this is a saxicolous lichen. Porphyria is the genus. Cladonia is probably one of the most dominant lichen genera that grows on the ground. And Cladonia is characterized by these podetia. They're just specialized structures. They have squamules. It's a squamulous thallus or body at the bottom, but then they have these reproductive structures that form these towers, and these are called podetia. But this is super common throughout the world and definitely in Colorado as well. Foliiculous lichens are a real treat. I've never actually seen one in person. They like really tropical areas. But it looks similar to this little rust fungus that's inhabiting in this underside of this leaf, but it's actually a lichenized fungus that's growing on a leaf. You can see this one's inhabiting this decaying wood, and it's just these little ellipsoid looking reproductive structures. Here's Lichenology lichens. Yes, quite confusing. This one's actually a really nice example of a Lichenology lichen. Usually they're a lot smaller. And this is common in Colorado, especially on sandstones. At lower elevations, you'll see Caloplaca trachyphylla. And where you see this species, this orange species with these bumps everywhere, you'll often see its parasite. It's almost obligately parasitic on Caloplaca trachyphylla, but it will occur on other things. But this is a really gorgeous example of Lichenology lichen, Acarospora stapfiana. And this is actually confusing a little bit, but the center here with the white thallus and the gray circles, or apothecia, is a Lichenology fungus or lichen called Diploschistes muscorum. The next section of the talk is getting into those reproductive structures that we've been seeing, so that we have language to talk about them. And my advisor is really into this stuff and has convinced me as well that lichen reproduction is super cool and some of the most important things about lichens. As of course we all know, lichens or reproduction is going to determine things about the population level processes and success, because you have to have a positive, population growth rate to maintain some level of survivorship. And it will also be really important for how these lichens evolve over time. And in the keys and descriptions of species, some of the most important morphological characters are going to be these reproductive structures. But you can imagine sexually reproducing organisms or lichens are going to have crossing over and meiosis, and going to contribute to genetic diversity in those species. And asexually reproducing lichens are just going to divide mitotically and be able to produce lots of offspring, but not necessarily as diverse offspring. So it's a really cool area of lichenology that's, again, vastly understudied and not well understood. So, and it's also this crazy world because you have the fungus and the algae trying to reproduce at the same time, and so you can imagine it gets a little bit weird. Um, so the fungus will reproduce sexually via these ascospores, which are depicted here, as well as reproduce asexually via conidia. And conidia are just basically cells that are mitotically derived, and they're these tiny little rod shapes usually, and they'll just float in the wind. They're very microscopic, like a few microns long. Um, and then algae can reproduce asexually via what we call lichenized diaspores. And so these are the fungal hyphae that are encasing the algae, and then these will just dust off from the lichen and go off into the wind and land somewhere and form a completely new lichen that is genetically identical to the lichen that it came from. So that's why it's asexual. But you'll notice that the sexual or fungus, when it reproduces sexually via ascospores, these will go blow off in the wind and not be associated with any algae. So they actually have to remake a new lichen every time that they reproduce sexually via ascospore formation. So the ascospore will land on a suitable substrate, but then it can't survive without the algae. So the algae and the germinating ascospore will have to find each other, communicate, and form a whole new lichen from scratch. And so all these fungal, I've mentioned the word apothecia before, but apothecia are these circular structures all around this. And so, and they're often abundant like this because, as you can imagine, the more ascospores you can make, the more likely you're going to be successful in reproducing. But the lichenized fungus is in Ascomycota. So they produce these, the shape where it's I'll show a cross section here. But if you were to cut one of those circles in half, it looks like a little cup. Hence, Ascomycota are the cup fungi. You may have seen these in pictures. They're relatively rare in their non-lichenized state. They're actually a lot more abundant in their lichenized form, but they're called the cup fungi because this reproductive structure looks like a cup. And the fungal life cycles are super complicated and definitely beyond the scope of this talk, but just know it's going through meiosis and producing these ascospores in these these sac-shaped little specialized structures here called asci. Apothecia also can look very malformed and irregular. And this is especially common in the genus Arthonia. Whereas you saw in the earlier picture, just a perfect little cup shape with a nice outline, these don't really have any of that. Yet there's still ascospores and apothecia. Yeah, as I mentioned, the sacs are called asci. And if you're ever gonna get really into lichenology and be identifying these things like on a serious level, you often have to be making cross sections of the apothecia and measuring certain things, especially the length and width of the spores. And it'll often ask you if the margin has any algae in it. And in this case, the margin of this Apothecium does have algae in it. So that would be considered what we call lecanorine. It's just this term that we use. And then if it didn't have algae in it, it would be called licidine. So there's a lot of jargon associated with this stuff. Sorry if I'm going too fast. I have a lot of slides and just kind of very informally introducing all this stuff. But if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. This is a really cool example of a foliose lichen. You can see the lobes at the periphery, but it almost becomes fruticose, where it produces these stalked apothecia. And this is in Colorado as well, usually on aspen bark tree scar or bark scars. Sorry, branch scars. Here's more examples of gorgeous apothecia. They have a lecanorine margin, or they have algae in the margin, but they are very irregular looking in this case. Ashley, your question is great. Do certain types of fungus need to meet up with certain types of algae to become a lichen? And the answer is probably yes. And almost certainly for some species. There are some generalist lichens or lichenized fungi that can meet up with lots of different types of algae, but there are also some that need a very specific species of algae to associate with. So there's not just apothecia, there's also what we call perithecia. And perithecia are essentially just sunken apothecia. They've sunken over evolutionary time or whatever into the body of the lichen. So they look like little flasks with a constricted top, and they open through a little ostiole. Whereas apothecia they usually have a very wide opening and look like big ass circles. And so perithecia look like these dome shaped things, and they're the black things here. And they're very diverse in their morphology. So these are all different examples of perithecia. But the main thing that makes a perithecium different from an apothecium is that they don't have that large opening, and they're usually sunken within the thallus. Just a few more examples of perithecia. And then beyond perithecia and apothecia, you have the lichenized diaspores that I mentioned earlier. These are asexual reproductive structures. And you have two main types. The first type is Ceridia, depicted here. And the main thing that differentiates Ceridia from the other type is that it lacks the cortex. So it's just fungal hyphae enveloping a few algal cells. And all of these little spheres here will break off and disperse in the wind. Here's another gorgeous picture of a ceridiate lichen. You can see the ceralia, or groups of ceridia, are called ceralia, but the ceralia look a completely different texture than the remainder of the thallus. And so that's how you can usually tell that it's ceridia, that it'll look usually very powdery and a completely different texture than the cortex because it lacks a cortex. Here's a microscopic image of of some Ceridia. The singular word for that is Ceridium, just like apothecium, and plural for apothecium is apothecia. Um, and as I mentioned, Ceralium is a patch of lichen surface where Ceridia are being produced. And that the medulla, the layer just below the algal layer, is exposed, and it's like a break in the cortex where these things basically erupt out of the surface. And they're constantly producing new Ceridia. And so it's just blown in the wind and pushed out. Because the more you can produce, the more likely one of them is going to be successful and produce a new lichen. And so the benefit of doing this asexual type of reproduction is you don't have to find that new algae and make a whole new lichen from scratch, because you have all the components that you need inside of a single Ceridium. The second most common form of asexual reproduction is isidia, and these are just corticate things that will break off, little corticate knobs. You can see one of them in this picture is broken. So they're a bit bigger, and you can usually tell them apart from Ceralia because their texture will be the same as the texture of the lichen. But their morphology is sometimes important for identifying. They can be branched or flattened or inflated. This is a Canoparmelia caroliniana is a pretty common lichen out east. But sometimes, and this is a foliose lichen, it's just zoomed in, but sometimes the isidia will become so dense that it will look just like a forest of little trees of asexual reproductive structures. But if you were to touch this lichen, it would just brush off, and like hundreds of these things would fall, and hopefully one of them would germinate. And this is a highly simplified. The Ceridia and Isidia are the two main types, but you can also just call them anything. Essentially, there's all these different names for different types of asexual propagules, and fragments of the thallus can go off and produce new lichens. Lobules are like little marginal things, like these guys are squamules, phylidia, lobules. It's all different variations of the same theme. So another pop quiz for y'all. Would you call these Ceridia or Isidia? Nice, yeah, Ceridia. Anyone have a guess? Yeah, apothecia. Yeah, these are apothecia, a form of sexual reproduction. Leptogium cyanescens is super common around here in really wet areas. It's a cyanolichen, so it associates with cyanobacteria. And yeah, these are Isidia. But they often just look like bumps on the surface of the lichen, as in this case. Actually, no, these are not Apothecia. They're Ceridia. Yeah, they're Ceridia. Um, Definitely confusing because they're circular. But you can see the powdery texture would probably give it away as Ceridia. That's a good guess. They do kind of look like Parathecia. Um, but if you look closely at some of the younger ones or some of these ones up top or on the sides, you can see that they have a margin and they're actually Apothecia. Um, Very dumbfounding organisms, very difficult. But yeah, if you were just looking at these convex ones or these dome-shaped ones, you might think Parathecia, but they're Apothecia. Oh, this is a really gorgeous picture. Apothecia, yeah, nice. These are in particular Lecanorine Apothecia, named after this genus, Lecanora. Very common and diverse genus. But Lecanorine means they have algae in the margin. You can see their margins are a little bit different than the upper part, which is called the disc. So Lecanorine Apothecia. Oh, this one's hard. But the name gives it away a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, squamules, lobules, Phylidia, Isidia, you could pretty much call them. But squamulose, yeah, Heterodermia squamulosa. This is my personal favorite genus at the moment. Another difficult one. Yeah, that would be the best guess based on the terms that we've used so far. They're technically not Parathecia, but they're like a specialized elongated structures called Leerlae. Um, but it's going to be sexual reproduction. Kind of a trick question, this one. Both. Yeah. Both Isidia and Apothecia in this picture. So the Isidia are the little column-like projections from the body of the lichen, and the Apothecia are these big honking circular things. Ochrolechia is actually very common in Colorado, and I'll show you the species that's common here in a bit. But yeah, as we've learned, lichens are extremely diverse in the way that they reproduce, and these reproductive structures are super important for understanding what species you're looking at, but also driving the entire biology of the symbiosis. And my advisor and her collaborator have worked kind of hard on this stuff and actually proposed that they might have at least 27 different ways of reproducing. And that's different combinations of sexual and asexual and without or with the fungus and the algae together. So it's a world of that you could spend the rest of your life studying and yeah, wowza, crazy. And oftentimes it is the case, actually, interestingly, from an evolutionary perspective, where fertile species, as in this Hypogymnia krogiae, is closest related to sterile species or an asexually reproducing species, such as this Hypogymnia incurvoides. And these are called species pairs in lichenology. And it was a hypothesis that was proposed a while back and is still debated to this day as to whether it has any meaning at all. But it seems to be the case that it's a common way that these species will diverge evolutionarily, such that there tends to be a fertile species that is most closely related to a sterile species or asexual species. The next little bit of this talk is talking about different ways that that lichens will get their nutrients. And so you might imagine your typical lichen, their mode of nutrition is lichenized, as in they get they're nutritionally specialized on algae. So they can't survive without algae and the photosynthates that algae produce. So that's called lichenized. But we as lichenologists will also study non-lichenized fungi that are decomposers. So this is paratheciate lichen that is decomposing this wood, but it's very closely related to lichenized fungi. So we as lichenologists tend to also study these. The next section of the talk is why are lichens important? You know, they're benefiting the ecosystem in many different ways, and they facilitate fundamental ecological processes, such as nutrient cycling, and they provide shelter for food and animals, or food provide shelter for animals, and a lot of undescribed insects you might find in just hiding from taxonomists in the thalli of lichens, and they're in close contact with rocks, and so they're the first things to colonize rocks. So they actually break down those rocks and produce the parent material needed to produce soil, and they also facilitate the maintenance of moist microclimates. So this is a really extreme example of this, but lichens facilitate nutrient cycling. So this is a bunch of different species of cladonia, but they're covering the entire ground, and so you can imagine they're actively a huge part of nutrient cycling in this forest. They're dominant across the majority of the ground, and as I said, like with structures like cephalodia, they actually produce a lot of nitrogen, and they filter rainwater, and all of these things. So lichens are essential for this, for nutrient cycling. They can become extreme This is 97% of the ground surface in some cases. And actually, it's been shown in ecosystems throughout that they're actually even when they're not covering 90% of the ground surface, they are providing a huge proportion of the nutrients that are being used in the system. They break down rocks. So yeah, they're in close, especially crustose. They're very tightly adhered to the rock surface, and they get a lot of their micronutrients from the rock. And so their hyphae will actually penetrate into and between the crystals in the rock and slowly break it down. And in some cases, they're the main source of biological weathering. This is just a gorgeous picture of um, basically one genus or a few genera that are hyper dominant in the western US. But they are the first to inhabit rocks after things like habitat destruction. If you were to go in the city of Boulder, open space and mountain parks, you'd see like 100 rocks that look just like this. And they can coat entire tree trunks, even in the arid Colorado. And so that moisture retention that happens when especially these fruticose growth forms cover trees, it's hugely important for maintaining a humid understory environment. And then in the Arctic, they're very brown and very dark compared to white snow. So they actually elevate temperatures because they absorb so much of that solar radiation that they facilitate snow melt and actually bring on spring metabolism. And it's actually been shown that they can photosynthesize underneath the snow, which is super cool. So they're actually so different than, or their reflective properties and absorbing properties are so different than the snow that they actually produce a little pocket of melted snow where it's perfect conditions, like ambient light is perfect and it's 100% relative humidity. So they're just photosynthesizing underneath the snow for potentially months before spring starts. And so this is one reason potentially why lichens are so dominant, especially in Arctic habitats or alpine environments in Colorado. This is this group of organisms, or the fruticose growth form, is a common site in the alpine in Colorado. And then this is in the genus Montanelia, group of brown foliose lichens that's super common in the foothills of the Front Range all around Denver. But you can see it's brown because it produces melanin, the same pigment that humans produce. As I mentioned before, especially these fruticose ones, they contribute to water holding capacity of the entire ecosystem. You can see it like all these cracks and crevices where water can hang out for longer periods and extend that biological activity because water is essential for all metabolism on Earth. And yeah, they feed anything from reindeer to snails, as the title of this slide suggests. In the Arctic and the entire herds of caribou will rely, especially in the winter, on the majority of their food will be lichens in the winter time. And some insects are co-evolved with these lichens and only feed on specific lichen species. Birds also use lichens to produce their nests because lichens have lots of antimicrobial properties and antifungal properties and a whole slew of chemicals that the lichenized fungus uses to protect the algae inside, are also beneficial or also happen to be useful for these organisms like birds. Here's another example. There's a whole group of lichen spiders that are adapted to be camouflaged on trees that are covered in lichens. So it's kind of hard to see, but there's actually a huge spider in here waiting to catch something. And with the beauty of a compound scope, if you're ever identifying lichens using a compound scope, you're going to see lots of little mites running around. If you've collected any lichens, they're ubiquitous and probably undescribed species of mites. So lichens host a vast amount of biodiversity at the micro scale. We haven't gone over this genus, so I'm just going to tell you the answer. I think this is Xanthoparmelia, this green rock-dwelling species here. But you can see that this insect is camouflaged to look exactly like the different rocks with lichens growing on it. I have mentioned this genus, but this is a really gorgeous insect that's mimicking. Does anyone know the genus? It's Fruticose. Usnea. Yeah. Old man's beard or Usnea. Again, another picture of an insect that looks like lichens, and there's probably some actual lichen fragments down in there. So they're actually dispersing the lichens as they crawl around as well, just like birds disperse fruits for vascular plants. Sweet. And the last section of the talk is just looking at some common Colorado lichens that you might see around. So the first one is Alectoria sarmentosa. I'll just give a quick spiel about each one. But this one looks like Usnea, but it's flattened. And so it's not circular, and you usually see it covering trees like this at about 11,000 feet in like moist north-facing forests. This is not necessarily common, but it's really cool. It actually doesn't have a substrate at all. It's what we call a vagrant lichen. And so it's just little bushes that float around in the wind. And I actually collected this specimen on top of North Table Mountain in Jefferson County. So it is known from around here. It's just a little bit more rare. Cercinaria hispida. Phaeophysia hispidula is characterized by these marginal black rhizines that stick out, and also its convex lobes or concave lobes. So they make a little bowl shape in some instances. And so if you see a foliose lichen with this black fringe on the outside, it's almost certainly Phaeophysia hispidula. And this is common especially in slightly more mesic areas next to streams. And we might see this on the tour if you're going on the tour. Sorry for the blurry image, but this is extremely common all the way from the foothills to the alpine. And its name is Fisconia muscagena because it grows on moss, or Musciculus muscagena. But it's characterized by these marginal flattened isidia that we call lobules. And it will also have a dusting. It'll look like little scales on top. Yeah, this is a better image of those scales. We call it pruina, but this powdery substance is common in this genus Fisconia. And Fisconia enteroxantha is very, very abundant in the Front Range foothills, and it's characterized mostly by the pruina, the foliose habit, and then also these. You'll see the ceralia or groups of ceridia appear to be yellow. And so if you see that, you're almost certainly looking at Fisconia enteroxantha. Ochrolechia upsaliensis is characterized by its white thallus and abundant apothecia that also have pruina on them. And you can see underneath they're orange, and they have really big lecanorine margins. And this will grow on mosses, usually in the alpine it's most abundant. But Ochrolechia upsaliensis is a really good one to know in Colorado. Rhizoplaca chrysoluca is a foliose lichen, and it's only attached at one central point. So it's attached just as babies are attached to their mother, and so we call that umbilicate. And it's characterized by its like yellow-green thallus that's with orange discs on the apothecia. And this is like probably one of the most abundant in the entire state. So a really good one to know, Rhizoplaca chrysoluca. This is the golden moonglow lichen, named for its color. You can imagine a golden moonlight. Dimolina orina. And it's characterized by its radiate margin. So it's a crustose habit, but it will look like almost foliose at the margin, and it will have these lobes that come out. And then it has black discs on the apothecia and lecanorine margins. This is, again, one of the most common lichens in the entire state. Peltigera canina is characterized by its, it has a rough upper surface. It has a little tomentum or hairs on the upper surface, and its rhizines will look like paintbrushes, and they'll be very long. And it's really easy potentially to confuse with Peltigera rufescens, but Peltigera canina will have these longer rhizines. And this is, again, one of the most common species that you'll see on the ground in Colorado. Peltigera canina. Xanthoria elegans, the sunburst lichen. It grows on rocks and is characterized by this dark orange color, and is abundantly fertile in most cases. Extremely common. Physiotribacea is characterized by its white foliose thallus and these marginal um, reproductive structures that look like isidia. We call them blastidia, but they're little beads that come off the margins. This is a really good genus in general to know. Physcia, if you see a white or gray, bluish gray foliose lichen on rocks, um, this is a really, your best guess is going to be Physcia, the rosette lichens. And then no lichen talk for Colorado would be complete without mentioning this genus Xanthoparmelia. It's characterized by by its yellowy green color, and it's almost ubiquitous on every single rock in the state. You'll find potentially up to 3 or 4 species of Xanthoparmelia on a single rock. This one's Xanthoparmelia mexicana. It's characterized by its brown isidia. But Xanthoparmelia in general is a really good genus to know. Really hard to say this one, Sharea fuscocinerea. And this one's really common as well. But it's characterized by this areolate thallus in dark gray color, and then these black discs. You'll often see it sterile though, and it will just look like dark gray crust with black dots in the center of each of these we call areoles. Lobothalia alpha placa has these big brown apothecia and this radiate or kind of loby margins, hence the name Lobothalia. This is kind of a plains and grassland species, and it usually prefers calcareous sandstones. And if you were to pick up any twig of ponderosa pine in the Front Range, you would see these two species. Lecanora densa is this green and yellow crust with lots of apothecia, and Rhinodyna coloradiana is pretty much everything else that you see in this image, but the black apothecia with the dark green thallus. And then anywhere above like 8,000 feet, you'll see this a lot, Montanelia ceridiata, characterized by the brown color and the white ceridia or ceralia, groups of ceridia. And this is a new species that we're describing, Heterodermia exuberans. And it actually has turned out to be very common. But heterodermia looks a lot like Physcia, and if you were to look at the underside of one of these lobes, you would see like a fuzzy underside instead of an underside that looks more dull like this. And so that's what separates heterodermia from Physcia. And thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And now we can just have informal chat about lichens.